Today's Rambam is very much a continuation of yesterday's Rambam, where we speak about the special korban, the special offering that is brought for a beis din that makes a mistake. I've always found this particular mitzvah to be one that I have a difficult time understanding. Today's Rambam is very much a continuation of yesterday's Rambam. Excuse me. But we speak about somebody's getting in my way. Okay, got him out of the Okay, anyhow, we got rid of that. They say some people's biggest fear is their very own shadow. Anyhow, today's mitzvah deals with today's mitzvah, what we started learning about yesterday and continue learning about today, is about when a beis din needs to bring an offering for giving the wrong instruction to the people. And I always found this particular mitzvah very perplexing, or more specifically today's chapter, because it sounds like it makes a lot of sense that if the beis din make a mistake, that they need to bring an offering. But what we see today in chapter 13 is that there are so many conditions that need to be in place for them to actually have to bring that offering, that it's in all the scenarios where those conditions are not met, I've wondered why they don't need to bring an offering. And I don't know if the commentaries speak about it, but let's take a look at the criteria, the conditions that need to be met in order for a beis din to be required to bring an offering. We spoke about the conditions yesterday, and now the Rambam spells them out. So what do we mean that we say that if one of the conditions are not met, then the court does not need to bring an offering, and instead the people that sinned do need to bring an offering? So these are all the scenarios where the court does not need to bring an offering, instead the people that sinned need to bring an offering. So what are the scenarios? If the court of one of the tribes ruled that the fat of the stomach is allowed to be eaten. So as we mentioned before, there are a number of mitzvahs relating to food. One of the mitzvahs relating to food is that an animal that's not slaughtered is not kosher. Another mitzvah is to only eat certain animals that chew the cud and have split hooves. There's another mitzvah that even if the animal is a kosher animal and the shechita, the shechting, the slaughtering was done correctly, so the animal is kosher, but there are parts of the animal that cannot be eaten, namely the blood and certain fats. Now this could be a little bit confusing because some fats of the animal may not be eaten and some fats may be eaten. If the beis din came along, the beis din of a particular tribe, and they said that the fat of the stomach is kosher. The fat of the stomach is kosher, but in fact it's not. And the people at that locale ate it as a result of these statements. The beis din does not bring an offering. It's exempt from bringing an offering, and whoever ate it do need to bring an offering, a fixed offering, a regular korban chatus, for his inadvertent transgression. Why? Because we said that it needs to be a beis din of not just one tribe, but of all of the Jewish people. Or majority at least. Similarly, if the High Court ruled that the blood that collects in the heart is allowed and may be eaten, but the head of the academy was not with them, or one of them was unfit to be appointed to the Sanhedrin, for example, he was a convert. Just in this week's parsha, we learned about how well we need to treat the convert. But that doesn't mean he's not a convert. This is Judaism's general view that a non-racist environment is not an environment where everybody is the same. It's rather an environment where each person is respected. And as far as a convert is concerned, a convert needs to actually be treated with a higher level of respect than others. The Torah says, you yourself are converts, you should know that. But that said, a convert is not allowed to be part of the Sanhedrin, the central beis din. And if one of the members of the Beis Din was a convert who actually is not, does not reach the qualifications to serve as, I shouldn't call it qualifications, it's not about qualities, who doesn't meet the criteria to be on the Beis Din, or there was a mamzer, somebody who was born from a very problematic union, or somebody who was too old, an old man, or somebody who was childless. These two are people that we worried might not be merciful enough, or the like. So the Beis Din was the Beis Din of the people at large, but something about the Beis Din was not right. Either the head of the academy was not present for this particular ruling, or one of the members of the Beis Din were actually not fitting the criteria to be on the Beis Din. Anyhow, the people acted on the ruling of the Beis Din, and they ate the blood that collects in the heart because the Beis Din said it's kosher. Still, the court is exempt, and whoever ate the animals need to bring an offering instead. Why? Because the second criteria is that it needs to be a Beis Din, a kosher Beis Din, and a Beis Din that has the head of the academy with them. What is the source that teaches us that the verse is referring only to the high court and not just to one particular tribe? As the Torah says, if the entire congregation of Israel shall inadvertently err, that means it needs to be the Beis Din that's representing everybody, not just the local court. What is the source that teaches that all must be fit to deliver rules? As it says, if the seers of the congregation, i.e., you must regard them as seers, and the Torah says that the congregation shall judge. Just as the term congregation used in reference, this is a bit of Talmudic study over here, not typical for the Rambam. Just as congregation used in reference to capital cases needs to be comprised of entirely of judges fit to render judgment, so to the term congregation in reference to inadvertent rulings and violations also need to be of a Beis Din that have all of their judges properly qualified for their positions or properly meeting the criteria of their positions. Similarly, if the court issued a ruling, this one I have a tough time with understanding. That's my issue. I need to learn it better, but I'm just sharing. If the court issued a ruling and one of them knew that they erred and protested, you're making an error. Now, how does a court work? They follow the majority. But those who sought to permit the matter outnumbered him, and they permitted it. So the Torah says that what do you do when you have two rabbis with two opinions? You take it to the Beis Din. What happens if in the Beis Din there are two rabbis with two opinions? You have a vote. You take a vote and you follow the vote. And so exactly what the Torah said should be done is what was done. One Dayan of the Beis Din said, this is a problem, it's not kosher. The other said it is kosher. Since he's a minority, we follow the majority. And then it's discovered that the minority, he was actually right. So the court does not bring an offering. Since it wasn't a unanimous decision by all the members of the court, so that again doesn't meet the criteria of where the court would bring the offering instead of the people. Instead, the people who actually sins, completely out of their control, they were just being good Jews following the Beis Din. They still would need to bring the offering. As the Torah says, if the entire congregation of Israel shall inadvertently err, it needs to be the entire Sanhedrin, which means it needs to be every member of the Beis Din that believes that this item was kosher, not that one didn't believe and he was outvoted. If that was the scenario, then it's not the Beis Din that brings the korban, rather it is the people. Now, obviously, it's worth just clarifying in case you didn't have this clear. But this isn't a discussion of who's at fault or who needs to take responsibility. If two of the three Dayanim made a mistake and they said something was kosher when in fact it wasn't, they certainly need to be held responsible. We're talking specifically about the atonement that's brought through an offering. And that particular atonement that's brought through an offering is something that can only be brought as a Beis Din instead of the people if it included every member of the Beis Din in unison making that mistake. If one or a lesser part of the Sanhedrin knew that those who sought to permit the matter erred, and he or they remained silent, since the ruling was issued, and there was no dissenting view, and the ruling was disseminated among the entire people, the court is liable. Here the court can bring the offering, and all those who acted on their ruling are exempt. So since what was voiced was a unanimous decision, even though one of those Dayanim was sitting quietly and he thought, this doesn't sit with me. This actually should never have happened. If he's a Dayan, he should have spoken up. So, but nonetheless, this seems very much like what's called the Gzeres HaKosov, the type of laws that it's a formula that we follow because God said so, even if we don't make much sense of it. That's what it seems to me without researching it. Because here, in the previous scenario, the guy that said, no, I don't think this is kosher. I mean, you say that the scales were all there, they just fell off. I think the fish never had scales. And in such a scenario, we say that the Beis Din cannot bring an offering because it wasn't a unanimous decision that it's kosher, but it wasn't. But in this scenario, one of the members of the Beis Din did the wrong thing, in my opinion, if I'm understanding this correctly. He remained silent when he knew that there was a problem. But since what was voiced was a unanimous decision that it's kosher, therefore they may bring an offering. If those who remained silent acted upon the court's ruling, then those individuals would need to bring their own offering, because as far as they were concerned, they knew that the Beis Din was making a mistake. And the moment the person knows the Beis Din is making a mistake, then he needs to bring the offering himself. Similarly, if the court debated and issued the issue and stated this matter is allowed, but did not issue a ruling and did not explicitly tell them, go ahead and eat, or go ahead and do such and such. So there was a debate, there was a conclusion, but there wasn't a final practical order of what needs to be done. And a person heard the decision that the matter is permitted and went and acted according to what he heard. So such people would need to bring their own offering, because he wasn't instructed by the Beis Din to go ahead and eat, that it's kosher. He just happened to overhear the verdict or the ruling with the Beis Din. As long as he doesn't receive an instruction to do so, then he would need to bring the offering and the court is exempt. Similarly, if they issued a ruling and the lesser portion of the congregation, only the minority of the people followed the Beis Din's ruling. Again, really everybody should be listening to the Beis Din. The Beis Din is something that the Torah itself sets up. But in this scenario where it was only a minority that actually listened, since they're a minority, so then it's not, since the majority of the people didn't follow their incorrect verdict and go ahead and sin, so the court does not bring an offering, the Beis Din doesn't, instead the individuals do. And the members of the Sanhedrin themselves act according to their own ruling. They are not counted when determining the majority. Instead, the majority must be comprised of others aside from the members of the Sanhedrin, of the courts. If the majority of the inhabitants of Israel, the Holy Land, acted according to the erroneous ruling, even if the transgressors were only from one tribe, this is strange scenarios. How could it be the majority of Israel and all just from one tribe? It's possible. It's possible that one tribe multiplies to be more than all the others. Unlikely, but it's possible. Similarly, if the majority of the tribes acted according to the erroneous ruling, even if they were a minority, that's a lot more possible, because it's just a majority of the 12 tribes, but of each tribe, it was still a minority, the total was still a minority. So the court is liable, meaning either of these two criteria make the court liable. It has to either be done by majority of the tribes or majority of the people. And then the people would not need to bring an offering. So how does this spell itself out? If there were 600,001 people living in Israel, those who acted according to the ruling of the court were 300,001. And they were all members of the tribe of Yehuda alone. Or they were members of 7 tribes, even if they numbered only 100,000. The court is liable for the sacrifice and the transgressors are exempt. We are not concerned with the inhabitants of the diaspora, for the term congregation applies only to the inhabitants of Israel. The tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh are not considered as two tribes in this context. Instead, they are counted as one. I'd like to believe that this will be one of the questions of the quiz, because it's it's a typical quiz question. Whether Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two sons, not counted as two tribes. Halacha number 3. If at the time the transgression was committed, the transgressors constituted the majority of the people when they sinned, but at the time they became aware of the transgression that had been committed, at this point they were a minority. A couple of babies were born. Either a minority of the people or minority of the tribes. He doesn't give the scenario of minority of the tribes. I guess it's less likely to happen in between. Or they were the lesser portion at the time of the transgression and became the majority. A couple of people died in the interim, so they were the minority, and now they're the majority. So the ruling whether or not the court is required to bring a sacrifice depends on the proportion at the time of the transgression. So we don't look at when they became aware, we look at what was on the ground at the time of the sin. Here's another scenario where the people at large are exempt. So here we say actually that, so here we go, let's see the scenario. The court issued a ruling that one of the types of forbidden fat was allowed. Like we said earlier, they said the fat of the stomach is allowed. And the lesser portion of the congregation ate it because of their ruling. So now the people are a minority, but that minority followed the Beis Din. They became aware that they sinned, the Beis Din, and retracted the ruling. Afterwards, they ruled that a particular form of worship of false deities was permitted, and again, a minority of the congregation followed them based on their ruling. If a majority of the congregation would be reached when the number of those who partook of the forbidden fat were added to the number of those who served a false idol. So now we have majority of the Jewish people having sinned, but on half of them on one account and the other half on another account. One moment. So so the two numbers are combined, which means at this point we say that it was a majority of the people that listened to the Beis Din, which means the Beis Din did accidentally mislead a majority of the people, and therefore the people are exempt. Even though the court became aware of their first error in the interim. When does the above apply? When it was one court that delivered both rulings. If, however, the members of the court that issued the first ruling died and another court arose and issued the second ruling, then the two groups of transgressions are not combined, and that means the Beis Din wouldn't be liable to bring the offering. Instead, every individual would have to bring it instead. Even if two courts issued rulings concerning one matter, like two types of forbidden fats, or two types of blood, and similarly, if the transgressors did not inadvertently sin because of the ruling, the court is exempt and all the transgressors are liable. So here's the next scenario where the court does not bring an offering, and that is where the people that sinned, had they asked the Beis Din would have said it's kosher, and then it would have been the Beis Din that has to bring the offering. But they didn't ask the Beis Din, they did it by themselves, and then they found out, hey, apparently the Beis Din was saying the same thing. Since they didn't sin based on the Beis Din's ruling, but based on their own mistake, which happened to be the same of that of the Beis Din, so then it wouldn't be the Beis Din that brings an offering. They would need to bring their own offering. How does this spell out? The court ruled that it is permissible to partake of the fat of the stomach in its entirety. One of the members of the congregation knew that the court made a mistake and that the fat of the stomach is not allowed. He nevertheless partook of the forbidden fat because he thought that it was a mitzvah to listen to the court even though they made a mistake. And there is such a halacha that if a Rav even says something that you think is black is white and something you think is white is black, you follow what the Rav says. But obviously it has its limitations. And in this scenario, he knew that they were making a mistake, but he decided that's what the Beis Din says, that's what I've got to do. So in such a scenario, since he knew that they were making a mistake, he would need to bring the offering. He is not included among the number of those who transgressed inadvertently because of their ruling. When does the Rambam apply? When the person who knew the error was a sage or a student who attained the knowledge that enables him to issue a ruling. Can't be some guy off the street that doesn't know what he's talking about. He needs to be a maven. If, however, he is a common person, he is exempt because his knowledge regarding the Torah's prohibitions is not definitive. He is thus included among those who transgressed inadvertently because of their rulings. So everybody else doesn't need to bring an offering because they were the majority and they listened to the Beis Din and they thought the Beis Din was right. He thought the Beis Din was wrong, but if he's an ignoramus, then that's irrelevant because he doesn't know. So therefore he would not be liable because it would be as if he didn't know that they were wrong, even though he did know because he wasn't qualified to know. Similarly, if one did not know that the court erred and intended to eat permitted fat, but instead ate the fat of the stomach, which is forbidden, which they said was allowed, but he did not know that it was the fat of the stomach. That individual, so he thought that actually he ate something that is, he ate the fat of the stomach. He thought he was eating kosher fat, and in fact he was eating fat that wasn't kosher, but which the Beis Din said was kosher. So in such a scenario, since the fact that he ate the stomach wasn't because he relied on the Beis Din, but because he thought it was something else, so he needs to bring his offering. Rationale is that his eating came as a result of his own inadvertent error, not because of their ruling. He is not included in the number of those who transgressed inadvertently because of their ruling. He doesn't constitute the majority. These concepts are alluded to by the Torah where it says, for the entire nation has erred unknowingly. Implied is that the entire nation committed the same error. Similarly, if the person acted on his own initiative and ate the fat of the stomach that the court ruled was allowed, but he did so not because of their ruling, but because he decided in his own right, I also think it's allowed. So then he would need to bring an offering. He cannot rely on the Beis Din because he did it basing it on himself, not on them. This is the general principle. Whenever one relies on the court, he's exempt, provided all of the original conditions were, that we mentioned were fulfilled. Anyone who is individually liable is not included when calculating whether a majority transgressed by mistake. When the court intentionally ruled incorrectly and permitted something that is forbidden, and the congregation erroneously acted on their ruling. So this is a bad Beis Din. So this is pretty hectic. The Beis Din knew it was wrong and they decided to rule that it was right. And then the people said, okay, if the Beis Din said it's fine, it's fine. Even though the people knew that the Beis Din knew that it was wrong and they were just saying that it's right. Sounds kind of like a form. I shouldn't say that on YouTube. Get into trouble. So the court is exempt from bringing a sacrifice because they acted intentionally. And we said a sacrifice won't help for an intentional sinner. Sacrifice would only help for an inadvertent sinner. And each of the people who acted upon their ruling needs to bring their own sin offering because he transgressed inadvertently. He thought he should listen to the Beis Din even when they say to do the wrong thing. If the court delivered an erroneous ruling unknowingly, and the congregation knew that they erred and that it is not correct to accept their ruling, and yet they acted in accordance with it, both the people and the court are exempt from bringing a sacrifice. The court is exempt because the congregation do not act according to their erroneous ruling, because the congregation, in other words, the congregation didn't think that it was fine. The congregation knew it's not fine, and it's just the person that's making a mistake. And all the transgressors are exempt because that's considered intentional, because they knew it wasn't allowed, and they did it anyhow. They thought that even though it's not allowed, they could still do it because the Beis Din said it's fine. Gentlemen, this particular chapter is one that I have quite a difficult time understanding certainly the logic behind it. But as we learn it, we still connect with Hashem and His wisdom. So thank you for joining me in this challenge. Let's test our knowledge. If the High Court erroneously issued a ruling which some of its members opposed and the people follow it, what should be done? So again, some of the members of the Beis Din disagreed with this ruling, and then they followed the majority, and the people followed the Beis Din's ruling. So do we say that since most of the members agreed to issue the ruling, the High Court is obligated to bring the 12 sin offerings for each tribe? Or do we say each person who sinned needs to bring his own sin offering? Or do we say the members of the court who were in favor of the ruling must bring a sin offering? What do you say? 1, 2, or 3? I think the answer is number 2.
Yeah.
Usually we follow the majority, but we said in this particular mitzvah, we don't. We don't say majority is enough. It needs to have been unanimous by all the members of the court, the whole congregation of the court. Do we count the Jews living in the diaspora in determining whether most of the Jewish people followed the ruling? Yes or no? No. Well done. If the court issued 2 erroneous rulings, and each time some of the people followed it, do we combine the 2 groups of people to form a majority of the Jewish people and obligate the court to bring the sin offerings?
Yes.
Yes. Wow, you guys are good. If the court issues an erroneous ruling permitting a certain forbidden food to be eaten, and a person ate it because he thought it was permitted anyways, not because the Beis Din said so, he just thought it's kosher, is he included in the 12 bulls offered by the High Court? Or does he need to bring his own one? Either do we say yes, since the majority of the people sinned, he's included with him, or do we say no? Only those who sinned because they followed the court's ruling are included. He must bring his own fixed sin offering.
Number 1.
I think it's number 2. As I think one of the key criteria over here is that the sinner needs to be doing so out of clear instruction by the Beis Din. In this scenario, he wasn't doing it because the Beis Din said so. He did it because he thought it was okay. Therefore, I think he's excluded and needs to bring his own offering. Thank you so much for joining.